Okay, I'm recording. All right, thanks for your patience on the long critique this morning, everybody. I appreciate it. Next week, we're going to talk about the final painting. Let me share my screen one more time with the image I'm going to be referencing today. If you want to take a screenshot, I also put it in the chat. I can put it there again, but I'll let you take a screenshot if needed right now. I'm going to use 9 by 12 Arches cold press. Also, I noticed a really funny thing about my tape. I swear, for the last couple of years, I've been saying I like the Scotch tape better
Mm.
than the 3M brand. They're the same brand. 3M, I guess, owns Scotch or Scotch owns 3M, but they're the same thing. So I've been talking with people. I'm like, I like Scotch. And they're like, oh, I prefer 3M. They're the same thing. Maybe the age of the tape matters. I feel like there's rolls of tape in my drawer here that gets neglected, or sometimes I'll reach for the newer one. But what you can't see me doing here is I put the tape on my pant leg or on my shirt, and then I like rip it off. That gets rid of some of the stickiness. So if you've been struggling with tape ripping up your paper, sorry, closer here. And then I don't push too hard. I just kind of gently lay it down. I know I'm some pretty basic stuff to go over here, but I do think it's important. So what I like about this image, and again, hopefully I don't jinx myself here, but it seems like it looks loose and fun to paint. And especially after last week, we can be a lot more flexible and forgiving with our proportions. So we'll talk about wet into wet versus wet into dry. We'll start off with some big fluid washes, and then we'll go one brush stroke at a time, adding in the rocks in the foreground.
My paper is 11 by 14. Is that okay?
That's okay. Yeah, yours will be bigger than mine, so you can be very adventurous with your initial washes. I was messing around in Photoshop just to see what this might look like hypothetically. I took the colors of the background and just blended them together really softly to try and whoops, see this image without the foreground elements. Because this, what happens when we have a reflection like this, the tide pools here are reflecting what's happening with the sky. So if we were to turn this upside down, you can kind of see closer to the horizon, it's brighter and a little bit warmer, maybe a tiny bit of yellow mixed in with this blue through here and through here. And then as we get further from the horizon, it gets into a darker blue. The main difference in the tide pools here is that we can see into them, and there's some darker darks. It gets a little bit less saturated. Where up here, it's a pretty consistent blue. And then through the middle here, it's obviously a really bright orange. I'm not going to worry about painting the windows or the buildings or the people. What I'm most interested in is the tide pools here themselves. So I'm probably going to downplay the background of the hills back there. I'm not going to ignore them, but they're not necessarily going to be the focal point. So something to think about. But that's basically my plan is to start off with some really big loose washes. Let me just organize my screen here. I have a million windows open from our critique. And I just want this to be like a fun, loose, expressive painting while still being really thoughtful on each move that we make. I want your focus this week to be on your final project. If you'd rather, if you don't feel like you don't have time to take on a final project and put a lot of hours in, if you want to just focus on this one, that's fine too. You can submit this for the final critique. I'm going to leave that up to you because I know everyone's schedule is different. So I'm going to use my big mega brush here. And I'm going to start out with just putting down some water.
So you have no sketch at all.
No, no sketch. The way I see it is we'll do this background wash and then let it cure, let it dry. Even if it's a little bit damp, maybe, and then I want to go in and paint on top of it.
Was that just water?
Just water.
Okay.
And then for the sky, I like using ultramarine blue. My cerulean gets a little bit too granulated. And then we heard from someone today, it might have been Allison, who used cobalt for the sky. That was also had some granulated qualities. So I'm going to start at the top here and let it drip down. Especially after the critique, I'm inspired to follow my own advice here and just go a little bit darker and bolder in the beginning. You can see as I'm doing a lot of brush strokes just because of what's comfortable going from right to left, and doing a couple in a row created a little bit of imbalance. If you want it to be even, you might have to switch that up. Maybe I go from left to right on another one. Each brush stroke is going to deposit the pigment in a slightly different way. So that was ultramarine blue. I'm going to add a tiny little touch of cadmium yellow to that. Move my palette closer so you can see it. So it looks a little bit more like a green gray, but I'm going to add more water too. I don't want this to be too dark, just to change the temperature slightly before the horizon. So that little bit of pigment will keep it, you can kind of see it's like just slightly different from the white of the paper. If you look in the sky right behind the horizon of the hills, and also in the tide pool area closer to the horizon, it's really pretty bright. It's not quite bright white. If you want to add in that moon, maybe we lift out a little bit. I'm going to wrap the paper towel around the brush here. I might move the moon over to the right. I feel like that might be a better spot for it. And I'm going to go pretty soft here. I think I just hurt the paper doing that. That was a bad idea. Oh no. Maybe I ignore the moon because I just kind of hurt my paper. I went too hard lifting that out. I need like a 5-second delay on the demo here so you guys don't follow me into my own mistakes. I tried to put the moon in and it didn't work. But what's more important to me here is now I'm going to kind of flip this back towards blue again. And this will just give us like the foundation to build this painting on top of. Excuse me, I have to mute myself just while I blow my nose. All right, so the buildings are a little bit above halfway here. I'm going to lift this blue out a little bit because the buildings and the cliffside are so saturated orange. I don't want that to mix too much with the blue I have. I'm going to add a little bit of water here too to smooth out this gradient. So kind of starting off with clear water here and moving up. Basically, I'm softening this edge. But with the reflections we're going after, this should more or less be like a mirror image flipped on top of itself. I'm going to clean off my palette too before I mix up these bright orange colors.
Oh, shoot.
I'm going to get some cadmium yellow and some cad red to make a really saturated, basically a cadmium orange. So if you have cadmium orange, this will probably look pretty similar. Dry this off a little bit more. And I'm just laying in like a big loose shape for the cliff face in general. There are some darker shadows within it, whether it's the bushes or the trees. And I'm going to start off darker and more saturated here. And as I move this way, it'll get lighter. So I'll add more water to the
Can
pigment.
you please say again how you made that orange if you don't have the regular orange?
It's cad yellow and cad red.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There's a couple of cliff faces over here that are also pretty saturated. The building up there. but I'm keeping it all pretty loose. I'm going to add just some, oops, just some, that was too much water, but I'm going to clean my brush off and pull the pigment across. For this big, simple band of orange. I actually see it a little bit in the tide pools on the left side, right here. So maybe I'll try and drop some of that in. Let's see what happens. I don't really know what's going to happen, but I'm going to drop this in right here and see if the gravity of my tilted paper brings this down. So it doesn't look like much right now. It's okay if it's a little bit messy. I can add like a darker and sharper green, like a warm green to the top of the hills here. Maybe a more like magenta brown over here for the bushes on top of the cliff. That can all be done a little bit later on. There's some darker grayish blues here at the shoreline. And then all of these rocks in here we can carve out with darker and sharper shapes, but just let these colors run into each other for now. I'd like to let this dry as much as we can. You know what we can do really quick? I'm going to put this outside and let it really dry. And then if we could go over one more painting from last week, maybe we could take a look at Frank's. Is that okay, Frank? Are you around and able to talk about your painting? Let me put this outside.
Yeah, I'm here.
We're multitasking today. This is really cool. Great shapes.
Oh, thanks.
I love the positive and negative space. There's a really nice rhythm to the elbows to the shoulder through the torsos and then the knees and the feet, which I know I probably sound repetitive, but I keep coming back to that with each of these are all a little bit different, but there's great rhythm in the figure. I wonder if the blue sky got a little bit dark, maybe. It's
Yeah, I used ultramarine deep, so it's a very dark ultramarine, and it was really difficult to work with. So it screwed up. I think it screwed up the painting as far as I was concerned. I got too focused on it.
I think it could work but if anything, the sky will get lighter closer to the horizon,
Yeah.
especially at the beach. I noticed it up in the mountains, the sky looks bluer just because the mountains come up so high, the horizon will be so far up that the sky seems darker, but you're just looking higher up into the sky. And then at sea level, it's the opposite. You see the absolute lowest horizon possible, and there's just so much, the atmosphere is so thick with moisture that it tends to get brighter and softer further down. This blue over here, I feel like works. So
Yeah,
it's a tricky thing to gauge. You kind of want to have your sky color ready as you go in and define the I like how you're defining the figure with the negative shapes. But
right.
and we looked at that earlier. Where's the reference? The sky being
Yes.
brighter than the shadow side, but darker than the light side, if that makes sense. Nice job, though. I wonder if this dark shape of the stand right here, if this came over just a little bit further, it might help define that knee a little bit more. Maybe this could curve just a tiny bit. It seems a little bit angular. And if that was a little bit
Right.
wider, it just looks a little bit thin, the support for the stand right there. And again, I know it's a weird arrangement of like the wooden pieces, but I just feel like if this, even with the elbow resting on it, if this came down a little bit more, it might help the composition. I think you could define
Right.
the kneecap there. It like kind of the kind of rounds out a little bit there. The where's our reference again? Sorry. It
Yeah.
starts the form of the knee like kind of goes down, like especially when we bend our knee, the kneecap sort of follows it. If you straighten your knee and then bend it, the kneecap will slide down. So there's a little bit of like plane, like a slow plane change of the femur there before the kneecap itself. That darkness of the stand might help define that. Just like a nice skin tone that kind of flows throughout the whole figure, though. How did it feel for you on your end?
Uh, I finally got the figure to a place that I liked it. I think the face and the torso could have been defined a little bit better. But I was pleased with the gesture. So that was that was good. And then I focused so much on that sky. It was ridiculous that I didn't really focus. I didn't do the rest of it to the point that it deserved. But and then just when I had trouble with the sky and it got to be one dark color, I just said, okay, I'm just going to go for some basic color and just try to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah, I do like the primary colors like coming through so well. I wonder if even now you could go in with like a cad red on the bathing suit and just see if that like
Yeah,
almost kind of balances out the like power of the sky, you know, and the towel's so bright too. Like I wonder if like a
right.
little bit more red through here, which would be a little bit more opaque, but I think it's all right. That whoops, might help. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe a little bit of a
Yeah,
shadow of like a darker red too, like an
yeah,
alizarin. Or that cast shadow on the bathing suit too might also help give that
right.
some form and like help because you've got a good like the core shadow moving through the figure here. So maybe the combo of both might help. Nice work though. Great job. Yeah, I agree with you on the overall gesture. That's hard to do, hard to capture, and you did well on that. Let me go grab my painting and see if it's fully cooked. I'll be right back. Pretty dry. I'm so mad at myself for messing up the sky. Like I thought I would just lift out the little moon shape right there, and I just like dug up the paper a little bit. So I don't know what the plan is there. I might have to go in with a little bit of gouache or something just to fix the moon situation.
The exact same thing happened to me, Shane.
I will then, that's my fault. I'm
The
sorry.
exact same thing, except I put my moon on the other side. So I might skip the moon.
I take responsibility for that happening to your painting.
Did you add green to the bottom of the painting or?
No, I added the tiniest bit of cad yellow to that blue near
Oh,
closer to the horizon, but I also added more water to make it brighter and just a little bit warmer with the green. So, or with the yellow. I mean, it kind of forms a really light sort of gray green, but just to get away from like the saturated blue here, as it gets brighter towards the horizon, it's going to get lighter, but also just a little bit less blue. So here it's not quite yellow or green. It's almost like just like a light gray you could think of. But that's what that came from. It's a little bit different down here. We could add in some more grays and everything because it goes from being reflective and opaque here to being transparent through here. And then we have this is a reflection here, but the reflection allows us to see into like the shadow of the table here. It gets a little complicated in there, so we'll see how far we get. Oh, I'm still screen sharing. Oh wait, yeah, I meant to be. Yeah, we'll see how far we get. So I think what I'd like to try next is some of these browns and greens of the horizon up here. We'll go from back to front. Since they're still far away, we don't want to get too dark here. Let's see, we could start off with some, I want to say burnt sienna. And then I'll add some more of the cad red and cad yellow. But I'm adding burnt sienna and a little bit of magenta or alizarin crimson. And this will give us like a dark, warm, orangey brown. And I'll make some marks here for the cliff side. I think before I hit the paper, I'd like it to feel kind of a little bit drier. So I'm gonna like knock it a little bit off of my brush here and drag it on its side.
did you lift some brown? No.
I'm sorry, what did you ask if I used some brown?
Yeah.
Yep, a little bit of burnt sienna mixed into that cad yellow, cad red mixture, and also a little bit of magenta.
Okay.
I'm just like gonna sketch these in here pretty lightly. I mentioned earlier, my main focus is going to be the tide pool itself. So I don't want to call too much attention to the background here.
I noticed you switched brushes there, so you're not no longer using the wash brush, you're using a round brush.
Yeah,
Yes,
this is a round 12.
12, thanks.
And I put in the pigment and then I like brushed it on a rag just a little bit to get some of the heavier moisture out. And then I just like dragged it and kind of rolled it on its side a little bit. And then from there, I'm going to bring up the horizon a little bit because I do want most of the painting is kind of in the bottom 2/3 here. The sky is a little bit smaller based on the composition of the photo, which I feel pretty good about. So I'm going to add in some more up above, which for it looks like green in those bushes in the hills, but it's a really warm green, almost kind of brownish in its own way. So I'm going to mix some ultramarine blue and lots of yellow ochre, which is like a warmer yellow. Maybe I'll grab a little bit of this orange and mix that in too. So it may not actually even end up being a green. Let's see how this looks. It's basically like a brown. Maybe after all that mixing, I could have just used raw umber. Since it's further away, there's a little bit less texture. So these brushstrokes are a little bit more wet, and I'm letting those mix in with the drier ones, which is kind of doing an interesting thing here.
And what color?
This was ultramarine blue with lots and lots of yellow ochre.
Oh, okay. No.
And I'm just putting some wet strokes in here along the beach. I'm not trying to draw the buildings necessarily. I'm trying to just look at what I see along that strip. If I squint, I'm trying to imagine those shapes as brushstrokes. Maybe they go a little bit more orange. Maybe I take some yellow ochre and mix it into the orange from earlier. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between these two here, you see on my palette. And I'm trying to imagine what I see as a collection of brushstrokes, not worrying about making it look like anything in particular.
Is the green supposed to be the trees?
Yeah, yeah, the trees and the bushes that are kind of intertwined with the buildings. Uh, like here, this is a little bit more green. There's a little bit more green. Up here, it goes back to this like brownish, almost kind of violet color. We could let this all dry and then go back in with maybe a slightly different temperature, but a similar value. That's a little bit cooler after this all dries. So I'm going to let this, what I have, sit for a little bit. Maybe I'll revisit it with just a couple of brush strokes. Okay, and maybe this over here, this texture of the dark bushes right here, I could also go in darker and maybe a little bit cooler later on. For now, I'm going to let it sit. I don't love it, like in the photo itself too. I don't love the shape of the way those bushes come down, so I want to figure out a way to loosen this up a little bit. Now I'm adding some cad yellow and just some water to add to the saturation here. And this orange just starts to touch a little bit of these rocks right here. This rock shape interrupts the beach behind it. So I'm just going to put down like a general color here. These rocks that kind of stand up in the middle ground that are more orange. I'm just putting some color down for those now. And those get less and less saturated as they come forward towards us. And as they kind of mix with this blue down here, they're also going to get more and more gray. I'm going to add this down here. The more these rocks stick up, the more vertical they are, the more they're getting hit with this direct but really low sunlight that's glowing really orange. So as that descends down, it kind of gets into the shadow of the earth from the sunset itself, and it misses out on some of that light. So that's part of what's happening here. As it gets lower towards the ground, it's getting darker and less saturated. So I'm kind of letting the orange sit into this blue layer from underneath. And I'm going to go in and just soften some of these edges.
What are you using now?
That was the same orange from earlier, just for the sand on the beach. I tried to
Okay.
add a little bit of water to make it lighter. If you look at the photo, these rocks here in the middle ground are a more saturated, darker orange. The sand on the beach is a similar color, but different value. It's a little bit lighter. So I tried to take that same color and put it like behind this rock by just adding some water, just kind of mixing this all together. I can go back in later with a blue kind of fitting behind that rock if I need. But this too, I'm going to let this dry for a minute. Maybe while this dries down here, I might revisit some of those shapes up above near the horizon. So I'm going to take that cool mixture from earlier that had a lot of yellow ochre in it, and I'm adding a little bit more blue now. It's still pretty wet here though. But just a couple of marks there. I'm just kind of letting those sink in. It's like a cooler greenish thing, but it's still overall pretty warm. It's not a full-on blue green, right? I just added some of the blue to make it darker and less saturated. So it looks muddy. If you look at my palette over here, it's pretty muddy, but that's just what I dropped into those couple little marks there.
I'm sorry, could you just remind me how you got that kind of grayish blue at the bottom? I missed that.
Of the first layer or of these shapes here?
Both.
That first layer was that first thing we did. We started off with just blue and then
Right.
went into a blue plus a tiny bit of cad yellow, but wait, just more water and just kind of more water through the middle here and then back through this color here, sort of repeated here,
Right.
and then back to just straight ultramarine blue at the bottom.
Okay.
So like,
What is it? Marine blue at the bottom?
yeah, that was just ultramarine blue. Basically, the sky up here is flipped down to the bottom here. It's the same thing, just giving us like a mirror image. It was just ultramarine blue towards the bottom. But I think because of my paper being tilted, the that cad yellow with the water probably spread out way more on the bottom section. And I think that works in our favor because the reflection is lighter and a little bit less saturated than the actual sky itself. So that band of lighter and warmer here near the horizon in the sky, as it's repeated down here, it got stretched out a little bit longer and they kind of ran to the bottom down here. I think that works in our favor just with the nature of the reflections that we see. So there's probably more water and cad yellow that kind of dripped down into this pocket of blue here. And then I just went over it with a little bit of this same orange, also watered down, and put it in some of these areas where I think the rocks are going to end up to give us the not necessarily the shadows in the rocks, but these like lighter grays of the barnacles and the just like the lighter rocks through here are more of a gray. But then we'll kind of link those up with a more heavy-handed shadow shape through the rocks. I wonder if I can. I'm gonna try something here. I'm gonna add some magenta to this orangey mixture. Just kind of looks like a darker but deeper cool red mixed into the orange on this here. So this was cad yellow and cad red, and I just added some magenta. I don't know if this is gonna work or not. Kind of didn't do anything actually. I think I liked it better before. Maybe I'll just leave that alone for now. Not sure how to handle that cliff face here. Maybe that'll reveal itself to me later. Maybe it won't. But I want to get into some of these tide pool shapes. I'm going to clean off my palette again and start fresh. So when I look at this, these rock forms are darker and cooler in the context of these really saturated oranges. So I could go in and mix like just like a dark gray, but I could also think about like what's useful in this kind of a painting. I think pushing these darks a little bit cooler will make the oranges seem brighter. I also want to think about we're painting the rocks, but we still want to be sure about like the rocks are a different color, different local color, right? The drier rocks, but there are some shadows here too that are actually really, really dark. So I'm going to reserve those for later and make more of like a middle medium gray here. And I might lean it more towards blue.
Back, and the guy was very nice and professional. They have a only one studio.
One more thing before we go in, because when I go in and paint these rocks, I don't really know what's going to happen, to be honest. And I'm not going to try and copy every single thing I see. It's going to be more of an abstract translation of the photo than like a straight up photocopy. One thing I don't want to mess up though is the sense of perspective. So what happens when we look at this is our horizon line is going to be at our eye level, not the horizon of like the top of the hill, but our actual eye level is probably around here. So I'd say all of the rocks are below that. But long story short, the closer the rocks are to the eye level, the more foreshortened they are. As they recede in space, they get stacked on top of each other in a more and more narrow way. As they get closer to be under our feet, we can look down and see into them more. So they're more opened up and bigger, closer to the bottom of the picture plane. And as we move up towards our eye level, they get more and more compressed or foreshortened or narrow. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah. Yes.
If this was a tile floor, the tiles would get smaller as they recede into space. I know the tide pools themselves are more organic, but we still want to have that sense of perspective while being loose and kind of gestural at the same time, which is kind of tricky. But that's kind of what makes this interesting, makes me want to paint it. So I'm going to make a dark gray with ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson or magenta, and then some burnt sienna, which I'm running out of. Let me grab some more here.
I'm sorry, say it again. Ultramarine blue.
Ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, just like all my dark colors that I use to mix like a dull, desaturated shadow, like a dark gray. And let's see where it gets us. If I had to pick for a dark gray, I think I want to aim it more towards a blue. So I'll show you what I mean. Like I can mix a neutral gray here. Maybe I'll throw in some burnt umber, which is dark and warm. That will mix with the dark and cool blue. But with the alizarin, it kind of goes a little bit towards violet. So I'll add a little bit more blue. So I'm left with this dark and cool muddy color, but more on the cool blue violet side rather than a dark but warm brownish color. Because the light shapes are really warm. So I think if the shadows are really cool, it will be a little bit more dynamic. But I'm gonna keep this really light to start. and I want to think about where to begin here. Maybe somewhere in the middle. And I'm just going to try and map out the shapes of the rocks that are in shadow. Because again, the rocks are kind of just below what the sunlight is hitting directly. You can see the cast shadows over here on the near the cliff. Now I'm looking at the photo, but I'm also trying to look at my whole painting here. Let me grab a bigger brush. The big mega round brush. What is this? 20? I like the bigger brush. I also, because I can stand further back, I'm holding it further back on the handle, way back here. So even though I'm using a big brush, I'm not like in here, like putting my face really super close up. I'm standing further back. This allows me to see more of the whole picture plane. So we talked about thumbnail drawings earlier today. When you stand further back in your field of vision, your painting gets smaller, so you can see more of it all at once. That also helps in scaling up. I can kind of, and then using a bigger brush, it's like I'm painting a smaller painting, even though my paper stays the same size. And this is like a balancing act of three different things. We have the shadows, like the rocks in shadow, the reflection of the sky, the brightest shapes here, but then also the rocks catching a little bit of light that are more orange that's happening over here. Those will become brighter as we add more and more darks, if that makes sense. So we've got this big rock form over here. There's a really dark shadow underneath it. But for right now, I'm just doing the general shadow shape. And basically I'm painting around the reflections. That's a better way to say it. You could think of it like positive and negative space if you look at it and squint. I'm painting the reflections by painting around them and thinking about what's the best shape to create movement through here or a path through here. I think part of why I like painting these and just thinking about the composition and the movement through it is partially coming from the act of actually walking through here. You kind of have to pick a path and stick to it. Maybe that part of my brain gets activated when I go back and paint it. So here, as all these forms are stacked, now they're going to start to like open up and get larger as we get lower. I'm doing more like stepping forward and back, looking back and forth at the photo and the painting than actual putting the brush on the paper. And now as I start to deviate from the photo, again, I'm not going to try and paint every rock that I see here. Although if you want to do that, you're more than welcome to. But I'm like picking and choosing certain elements and ignoring others. But once I start to make this positive and negative space more clear of the rocks versus the reflections, I do want to commit, or at least I don't. The rocks, there's some wiggle room to explore with texture and value and edge. The reflections we want to keep pretty pristine. So I'm starting to commit to those shapes. And part of what I'm looking at, let me share my screen. These edges along here that are very sharp and crisp, not necessarily dark. I know these are really dark right here. We'll get into those later. But where it's really clear, so here's a good example. We've got this tide pool right here. Let me go in Photoshop so I can circle it. This one, oh, sorry, that's a bad color. One more try. This one has a sharp edge up here, higher contrast in value and edge towards the top. And then towards the bottom, it's sort of a broken edge. It's rougher. There's less contrast in edge and value. So that sticks out to me as an interesting and efficient way to show this tide pool. So I don't have to put that in the same shape and size on my painting, but I can use that information to create a similar effect with darker and sharper towards the top and then rougher and looser towards the bottom edge. Even if I just use that concept in general to inform all of these marks. So maybe I'll grab a little bit more pigment, slightly smaller brush, and I'll find a spot to plug that in. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit on this, but I think it's okay. Actually, I'm kind of doing that here, I guess. You can kind of see here, like the nature of like how I pulled the brushstroke through. Whoops. Hold on, I just messed up my own painting. Whatever, it's fine. It's a tide pool. But here is like darker and sharper up here. See, I'm like adding to that and just letting the pigment bleed out a little bit around that. It's softer and kind of rough down here. So I just wanted to show how I'm like taking that information and then using it to like inform these marks without necessarily copying it. So I'll try a few more of those. It's starting to take shape. It's starting to feel like there's a ground plane here with a reflection. Then by repeating similar marks up here, but making them smaller and smaller is also going to create a sense of space and depth. And here too, I don't want to be too heavy-handed and obvious and like trying to create a path through here. So think about how you can create movement, but not, but like how can you like divert that movement through like almost like how a river might flow through here. Oh my God, it's 12? Yikes. I need an alarm clock. Sorry, folks. I hope I'm not leaving you hanging here. I'm gonna keep working, but I did not realize it was 12. It was so peaceful and quiet. Okay, let's let this sit for a minute then. Darn, that was so fast. Let's go a little bit darker, actually, just while we're here. What I'd like to do next is just a similar pass, but darker and sharper still. And we'll see where that gets us. I'm mixing more colors together here. I feel like the tide pools, there's a lot of like richness in the colors in the darks. Even if the photo loses some of them, I feel like there's more greens and yellows and purples than we're seeing in the photo. So I'm just mixing a bunch of darker pigments together here. Ultramarine blue, cad yellow, alizarin crimson, just like a kind of a muddy mess if you see my palette here on the left. And the pigments will start to separate a little bit, and I think that's good. I'm just gonna like use them as a muddy, super dark, and then just let these bleed into. Remember, I'm gonna follow that system of the darker and sharp, clean lines.
Would you name those colors again?
Sure, I used ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, cad yellow, and magenta. So
Okay.
it's not quite, if I show you my palette here, you can kind of see it's like pretty messy. If you look really close, you can see the colors starting to separate. It's kind of a
Uh-huh.
psychedelic pigment bath happening. And I'm just gonna lean into that and let the chaos help us create these tide pool colors. Because if you look really close, there's just some like really beautiful stuff happening color wise. Like these greens and yellows in here meeting up with these like fiery oranges. some more violets, and then lots of gray too. So let's just see what happens. If we stick to that idea of like what is in the reflection and what's not, where the rocks meet the water's edge, we might be able to just let the paint do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Let's see. So I'm thinking about the direction of my marks. I don't want them to all be the same.
I think that's why if you're going to be near these places, you should just stop in to them.
I'm going to drop off some of this pigment here and go in a little bit drier. Something like this that's a little bit more experimental. There are a lot of things that can be figured out along the way here, and then maybe used again in repeating the same painting. That's what I'm finding. Like I already want to paint this again with the knowledge that we've like figured out along the way here. I'm enjoying with this round brush, like putting a mark down and then twisting the brush and pulling it along. It like disperses the pigment in a really interesting way.
Shane, I've got to take off, but wanted to say thanks for the info on the critique today.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful, and this is a fun painting to do, so we'll see you next week.
Okay, I'll see you next week. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Thanks. I have to sign off too. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. If you have to leave, thanks for being here. I had a lot of fun today. I had fun with this painting. I'm going to keep working on it a little bit longer, and then we'll get back to the critiques we did not get to yet today. But thanks for being here, everyone. I appreciate your patience and your participation. As we recede further into space, I'm slowly mixing in a little bit more water with each mark, just to decrease the value contrast ever so slightly as we get further back. Even if the photo, if they're pretty much all the same, I could still create the illusion of space, more atmospheric perspective, because this rock over here, there's more air between us than these rocks here. So a slightly lighter value is gonna create some more space there, I think. And if you're watching me paint and you're thinking, I don't totally understand what's happening here, I'm not sure I do either. I'm just kind of following the rules of painting around these reflections. The difference in the rocks here is, are they more in the sunlight and they're more orange, or are they in the shadow and more of this cool purplish gray that I have? And letting the paint in the water, the pigment in the water, cool up and like bloom around the drier shapes, which happens to be how the tide pool acts in real life. We see more of like the textured barnacle edges of certain pools and then smoother transitions of others. Maybe it's better to let this dry for a little bit and then keep going back and getting a little bit darker and sharper each time. There is an interesting like dark green gray happening down here, looking into the tide pool itself, that I might want to try out here. So I'll take some blue, and so it's more of a cool green though, so maybe some Viridian, and or maybe the Hooker's green with ultramarine blue. And I don't want it to be too much of a cool green, so I'll add a little bit of yellow ochre to counterbalance the temperature just slightly. That's ultramarine blue, Hooker's green, and yellow ochre for whatever this is right here. I'll get lots of water too. Maybe I need a bigger brush. Looking into the tide pool now. And then I'll soften those out as that kind of moves up towards the horizon into the brighter sections of the tide pool. That we want to be pretty seamless, the surface of the water. And then that can make more sense by dropping more dark shapes into that later on. But I'll let that dry. This thing's more or less set up for another pass or two, but I'll let that marinate for now.